In the movement of the yoga to break free from the ego, the journey takes us into the experience of cosmic consciousness. And we saw how the first movement of the yoga takes us into the oneness. One could stop there, separated from the world, knowing only the oneness and the infinity beyond the world. Or one can turn back upon the world and re-embrace it from the poise of the oneness. In this movement, Sri Aurobindo describes two possibilities. The first, in which the oneness turns, embraces the world, but leaves the mind and the body as a projection or an appendage to the vaster cosmic consciousness. Or one could begin a process within the mind, life and body to break their walls laterally and bring about a liberation on each of these with the help of the higher cosmic consciousness in spirit, assisting this process. And then it leads to the more complete experience, in which the mind itself is experienced as a part of a cosmic mind, our life as a wave in the cosmic life, and our body itself a movement in the movement of a matter in the whole cosmos. This is the direction in which he has been taking us in the chapter called The Cosmic Consciousness. And at this point, when one has an experience which may be called the cosmic consciousness in the body, in life, in mind, and in spirit, he says it may even seem as if it were the greatest oneness, since it accepts all that we can be sensible of in the mind-created world as our own. Sometimes one sees it spoken of as the highest achievement, and then he gives his own view. Certainly it is a great realization and the path to a greater. And it is to this greater realization that the rest of the text describes the process for. But here at this point, we can pause and explore certain nuances of this experience and what they represent in the perspective of some of the more traditional paths. First of all, we find he's speaking of the domain of mind, life, and body as the mind-created world. This oneness may seem to be the greatest oneness since it accepts all that we can be sensible of in the mind-created world as our own. And this particular phrasing has special meaning in the context where we are looking at things from above. When we look from above, our base, our roots are in the oneness of the origin from which the whole universe pours out. At that point, we have the experience of worlds which are founded in oneness, the Satchidananda. And then we find a transition into worlds which are founded not on oneness, on division, on separation, in which oneness is as if entirely lost, unrecoverable. That transition to the worlds which are not based on oneness begins with the experience of the separative mind. When oneness moves, it can break out infinitely diverse infinities and still not lose the oneness. The oneness is not such a fragile thing. It is what holds all reality. It is the only reality. And because it is the only reality, there is nothing which is not itself. And so it can pour itself unendingly into infinities of infinities, apparently separate. But to the oneness, they are all held in itself. The oneness can never be lost, since that is the essential reality. How then does the divine form an experience in which you lose oneness? If oneness cannot be lost, it is almost impossible to even conceive of an experience where oneness is lost. Unless he chooses in his freedom, by his very power of expression, but the full power of his expression, create a semblance of division, and then use another power to conceal or as if set aside the experience of oneness by an exclusive focus on the division. Now this is a great power. It is an extraordinary power because what it is achieving is an experience which is impossible. Because oneness is the very reality and the very substance of things. And yet this is achieved. And this creative power, this special faculty is what we have called mind. Not just the human rational mind, but something much larger. Sri Aurobindo refers to it with a capital M. Mind, which includes many higher gradations beyond the intellectual powers. All the way to what Sri Aurobindo has called the overmind consciousness. And so from that grade on, there is the possibility of experiencing things in exclusion. So how it does that, the oneness, as it pours out infinitely, it dwells on each of these infinite possibilities. Between any of them, an infinity of possibilities. And upon each, it pours itself entirely, remember. But now comes the secret of its working. It puts itself entirely and as if sets aside the memory of the oneness. It's not gone, it's there, it's at the backdrop. We may use an analogy in the human experience, perhaps a poignant one, not necessarily very happy, but poignant nevertheless. When, let's take a historical case, when during the colonial period in India, some of the freedom fighters were condemned to the gallows. Consider the state of mind of the person. They will eat, they will sleep, they may be free to do anything, but at the back of the mind is this reference. There's no way you can erase that. It is something so significant, so imposing. Sri Aurobindo describes how some of them were even laughing and chatting as if everything was fine. But that being their temperament, still the fact remains at the back of the mind, this thing remains something unforgettable. I'm taking this as a very intense example, but the same principle would extend in milder experiences of human life. Let's say you had a meeting with somebody whom you revere, a sage, a powerful politician, or a businessman who is going to give you the greatest deal of your life. The appointment is made, it is something so important for you. You may be busy in the midst of any activity, but somewhere at the back of the mind be this as reference. It is in this sense that Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, back of the mind. And when the oneness concentrates into this multiplicity, it holds the oneness always. But that oneness can as if recede to the back. Never lost. Cannot be lost. And then comes the second movement of its skill to conceal the oneness. And this, of course, may take place through a series of concealments. It could be done in one go, but there would still be something, and so another layer and another layer. So the oneness as if recedes one step, and you have in the overmental experience the whole universe. You see it as an expression of the oneness, but with an exaggeration of your perspective. It's as if you take a coin, there are two sides to it. This side looks at the whole universe. That side looks at the whole universe. The universe they see is exactly the same. But to its perspective, this side is special. To the other's perspective, that side is special somehow. But they're still looking at everything. And this gives you a sense of the overmind consciousness. Everything is there, everything is known, everything is completely seen, but with an exaggeration of an aspect. It is on this level that one has the experience of the aspects of the divine as special faces, special powers of consciousness. The divine as all love, the divine as all power, the divine as all knowledge. And this knowledge suffuses everything in the universe, but it is seen through the lens of knowledge. The love suffuses the universe, but it is seen through as an expression of love, or all power. Even the knowledge is secondary to the power, and the love is only secondary to the power. And so in this way, we have facets. And on some level, when the facets form, we know they are all facets of the same one. It is on this level that the Vedic deities are described. They all know their underlying oneness. But once they move into their activity, there can be a further screen as if, oh yes, there is that oneness, but it has no active influence. And another screen, further veiling and further veiling. And so we have a series of gradations in mind, capital M, layering, until we come to this particular experience of mind that we have, in which, as a human being, we can be conscious of ourselves, we can be conscious of other things, we have a focal point of one center, I am the center of the universe. And in the little space that I am able to see, I can conceive of all this as being one energy flowing. an idea of oneness. But the experience of oneness is just an idea. We may enter an emotional experience, an empathic experience. This is me. I hug the tree and I feel momentarily a sense of oneness. But they're all pieces, they're fragments, they're glimpses at best, reflections of the true oneness, which is completely lost. And it is through these reflections that we are reminded that there is something more, something greater, but now so distant, covered in so many layers, that even if the mind constructs an idea of oneness, it is at best a very pale reflection of that. So we have this series, layers separating. And by special skill, this domain of experience of division has been formed. But the starting point of it is the split created where the mind can begin to separate from oneness and focus more and more in exclusion on parts. So this range he describes as mind-created world. Everything above that is ruled by oneness. Everything below that, mind-created, does not experience oneness except as reflections or indirect experiences. So this experience, it may even seem as if this experience is the greatest oneness, since it accepts all that we can be sensible of in the mind-created world as our own. So there is a spiritual oneness we have seen before, and now there is a oneness in the mind, oneness in the emotion, oneness even in the body consciousness with all things of the universe. And it seems to be now so complete because all this mind-created world is also embraced in oneness. Sometimes one sees it spoken of as the highest achievement. Certainly it is a great realization and the path to a greater. It is that which, as the accepting of all existences as if oneself, whether in grief or in joy. It is the way of sympathetic oneness and infinite compassion by which the Buddhist arrives at his nirvana. So these are two references he makes to more traditional paths, and it is worth exploring them. First, in the Bhagavad Gita, we find this in chapter 6, verse number 32, in which this line appears. This is part of a larger discussion where Sri Krishna is describing the man who has attained the highest bliss of the soul in union with the Brahman. That is verse 27. He says, when the mind is thoroughly quieted, then there comes upon the yogin stainless, passionless, the highest bliss of the soul that has become the Brahman. So this is the experience of immersion in the One. Thus freed from stain of passion and putting himself constantly into yoga, the yogin easily and happily enjoys the touch of the Brahman, which is an exceeding bliss. And next, verse 29, the man whose self is in yoga sees the self in all beings, and all beings in the self. He is equal visioned everywhere. Verse 30, he who sees me everywhere and sees all in me, to him I do not get lost, nor does he get lost to me. Now you'll see in these three verses, building gradually the depth of the experience. So there is first the freedom from passion, being constantly in the union, in the oneness, and the touch of the Brahman, which is an exceeding bliss. And as this grows, the freedom from passions and confusions fade, the freedom grows, and there is this blissfulness that begins to come. In the next verse, he sees the self in all beings and all beings in the self and experiences therefore this equality. Myself in all things, because my own consciousness is merged in the oneness. I am in all things. Oh, and those things are in me equally. The barriers have been broken. But so far, it is still the oneness. The oneness now evolves into the perception of the one divine as a conscious being, leading to a much deeper intimacy. So he says, he who sees me everywhere and sees all in me. So one perceives the divine himself as consciously present in all things, and all things are in his universal cosmic body. To him I do not get lost, nor does he get lost to me. Meaning at this point, that connection can never be lost. There is no experience in which you do not see the divine present, vividly, concretely, as the thing itself. Nor can there ever be that experience where you have lost the link to the divine because of immersion in some special focus? That is the second aspect when he says, nor does he get lost to me. Otherwise you will see, and it's a common experience for all of us, we have certain days in which we have built up a certain intensity and depth of experience, of closeness with the divine. And then we somehow get pulled into some work, exaggerated into that pull, sustained over a few days perhaps, and then suddenly it feels as if everything has receded. Because there is still the work which is not in that consciousness. When that consciousness is equally in all things, you may immerse yourself in anything to whatever degree you're still meeting the same one, the same Lord. So I do not get lost, nor does he get lost to me. Verse 31. The yogin who has taken his stand upon oneness and loves me in all beings, however, and in all ways, he lives and acts in me. So you will see in the experience of the oneness, we see the culmination of the yoga of knowledge. And then he says, loves me in all beings. That is the culmination of the yoga of devotion. And the two have merged. And in whatever way he lives and acts in me. Now comes the verse which Sri Aurobindo is referring to, verse 32. He, O Arjuna, who sees with equality everything in the image of the self, whether it be grief or it be happiness, him I hold to be the supreme yogin. So, in such a person, he looks upon all things in the world, and even things which are in grief and things which are in happiness, he views them with equality. But the equality is not a dullness, it's not an insensitivity. It is the equality that comes because you see all things as the image of the same one self. As yourself, your own larger cosmic being, in this which is in grief as well as that which is in happiness. And so this, the Gita, Sri Krishna describes as, him I hold to be the supreme yogin. And this is what Sri Aurobindo is referring to. It is that which the Gita speaks of as the accepting of all existences as if oneself, whether in grief or in joy. And you see, this is raised to the supreme level because it embraces everything in the world created by mind. On the other side, in the Buddhist example, and these two Sri Aurobindo takes because they seem to be complementary in their approach. The approach of the Gita is affirming life, demands realization and action in life, whereas in the more extreme form of Buddhist practice, the result is a withdrawal from life and an immersion into the nirvana. So even on the other approach of the spiritual life, he says, it is the way of sympathetic and infinite compassion by which the Buddhist arrives at his nirvana. The sympathetic oneness. You experience by sympathy that the other is yourself. In sympathy, one experiences a commonality. In sympathy, one experiences a partial identification. But if you cultivate this with all beings, bit by bit, you will experience some kind of a dissolution of your own narrowness, of your own littleness. I have had over the years occasion to participate in many Buddhist ceremonies around the world, and it is fascinating to see this aspect so emphasized. The constant reminder that there are beings who are suffering everywhere in the world. You yourself are suffering, but rather than focusing on your own suffering, remind yourself of all the suffering of the others. Put yourself to the service of the others to relieve their suffering. And in the process, you forget your own suffering. Yours is so small after all, isn't it? If you have 10 people around you, that's already 10 more than you. If the suffering is a tiny drop. And in that very act of selfless giving in service, you begin to break the boundaries of your littleness, pettiness of ego. But if there is this identification in the other, the sense of taking on their burden, that completes the sympathetic oneness. And this is something which to me was uncomfortable at first, because one would see in many of these gatherings this idea that let all their suffering come into me. And I said, no, that's not what I want. How do they do that? Don't they get overwhelmed? Doesn't their heart become too full of... But well, they do that. And just that idea is intended to create this bond, this link, this sympathy, and a sense of oneness, that their pain is equally my pain. And so he uses two phrases, sympathetic oneness, and these are the practices which you see summarizing this, and the other is infinite compassion. And in this infinite compassion, you do not have this mixture of the idea of suffering. There is rather the giving, the metta. It is a distortion of the Sanskrit word maitri. Maitri is friendship, love, affection, but at a level which is still human in emotion, not a divine love. And this comes from the recognition of spirituality of this sympathicness. So in the particular sequence in the practice, the first focus is on the suffering. Out of that suffering comes the compassion. Mala, I have a paper here in my bag. माझी green bag आहे. माझी green bag आहे इथे. आता travel आता आलेली. This is around this. Okay. There is a very beautiful formulation of this. I must share this with you, but I have to take it out of my bag. I'll take a moment. It is a statement which comes from one of the great saints of modern times, little known in the world, very famous in Cambodia. When Cambodia went through its great destruction during the reign of the Khmer Rouge, it was a massacre. Millions of people butchered. There's still no logic to what they did and why they did. They would go into the fields, they would go into the villages, anybody wearing specs, grab them and kill them. Knowledge, learning, anyone who could lead, who could awaken people had to be killed. And literally piles and piles of bodies and skulls gathered. Nobody knew who had survived. Families were exterminated, divided, split. No food, no shelter. They went through villages simply burning houses. Nothing was left. It was literally ravaging the whole country for years. This saint, Venerable Mahaghoshananda, at the end of the rule of the Khmer Rouge, he began this process of healing the country. That's his picture. His saying, and this is what I will read out, and you will see this whole approach encapsulated here. The suffering of Cambodia has been deep. From this suffering comes great compassion. Great compassion makes a peaceful heart. A peaceful heart makes a peaceful person. A peaceful person makes a peaceful family. A peaceful family makes a peaceful community. A peaceful community makes a peaceful nation. A peaceful nation makes a peaceful world. May all beings live in happiness and peace. Very simply stated, but the first three lines basically summarize the logic of this. The suffering, which is deep, that you first recognize. Second step, from this suffering comes great compassion. Third step, great compassion makes a peaceful heart. Now, it's not always true. Suffering doesn't always awaken compassion. It awakens hate. It equally awakens reactions and so on. Sri Aurobindo makes reference to this when Gandhiji used to speak along similar lines, that suffering will purify you. And Sri Aurobindo said that's bad psychology. Generally what happens is those who suffer, they tend to inflict the same suffering on others. But it is precisely this which is the specific conscious practice of Buddhism. If you let yourself follow the instinct, then suffering will lead probably to great suffering, perpetually in a cycle. But the practice here is to transform that suffering into great compassion. And the greater the suffering, the more compassionate you become. That others may not suffer, that you heal others and so on. So he was an embodiment of this practice. And we had occasion to hear many times from one of his followers who follows in his line now, walking all over. He used to walk from one place to another, journey through Cambodia. Putting water on all those who came before him. And when asked what he was doing, he said, "We are washing away the war." So in the leaflet which is associated with his institution, they quote the Buddha. The Buddha said, "I teach only two things, suffering and the end of suffering." You see, this is the distinction which makes Buddhism and aligns to its purpose. The goal of Buddha's teaching was not to find the explanation for the world or the liberation to be able to participate or enjoy the world. His one question was how to get free from suffering. And there's no one answer, there are many answers to this. So his particular question was, what is the shortest route to get free from suffering? So he teaches suffering and the end of suffering, but by the shortest route. And the shortest route is to get out of the relative into the absolute. In the process, it does not matter whether God exists, what the purpose, the cause, the origin of the universe is. None of these questions matter. So when he was asked, does God exist? He just kept silent. Irrelevant question. He could have said yes, because that was also his experience. He could have said no, because that is not the way, it's not the way people understand it, but he kept silent. So, in this text, they also teach, the Buddha also taught that suffering teaches us compassion. Perhaps we cannot stop the conflict or cure the suffering, but we can walk with those who do suffer, letting them know that they are not alone and seeking ways to ease the pain. And so you see, the whole thing is being with others. As Cesar Chavez said, to be human is to suffer for others. God helps us to be human. Out of your own compassion, we hope you will walk with us. This is the leaflet from their institution. And the person who was representing him, one of his earliest disciples, was a white American who lived there in Cambodia subsequently, and by the name of Bob Mart. He still walks, never rides, lives as a monk. And in the meeting we had, he concluded after sharing his story. He said, I'm glad that after me, you will all continue the walk. These were very intense experiences we had with some of these people, and in these spaces where there has been so much suffering. And you can see how, when you grow up with this perspective, when you begin to think like this, and you make your whole life oriented to this single one purpose, your world is seen only in these two realities: suffering, compassion, and through it, freedom from suffering. That's it. And this you will find at the heart of most Buddhist communities and practices everywhere in the world. So, it is the way of sympathetic oneness, that's the part which you're sharing in the suffering, and infinite compassion. Now this needs some elaboration. So out of this great suffering comes the great compassion. But how great? After all, you are sharing in the suffering of the whole universe. How far can you go? How many people can you ease? Can you give some sense of solace? For how long? You will walk away, they continue with their problems. And this is where you have the Amitabha Buddha, the aspect of the Buddha who turns back from the borderline of the absolute to re-embrace his creation with the vow that he will not merge into the absolute until the whole of creation is liberated, freed from their suffering. Now this is the aspect of the Buddha where he is about to merge. He is entirely free of the suffering, but pauses there on the edge to turn back, and the gaze is of an infinite compassion, coming from the oneness of the absolute, embracing the whole of the relativity, and embracing with his metta, the divine compassion. What is the scope of that? Infinite. It embraces the whole cosmos, all creation, across time, across space. And it is towards this that the Buddhist practice is meant to take you. Increasingly, as your own consciousness is liberated from its narrow ego center, as the metta, the compassion from your heart grows, it must become as boundless as the liberated consciousness in which you live. And therefore, sympathetic oneness and infinite compassion. And it is only when the compassion is infinite you can take the burden of all suffering beings. Repeatedly, we saw in many of these Buddhist gatherings that at the end of any gathering, they gave great value to the positive karma generated by these meetings. And because of this aspect of karma being so strong, I think we've discussed this before, if you remove the aspect of the freedom of the soul, if you remove the freedom of the self, what remains? Everything becomes almost mechanical, machine-like. There is no freedom. All is interdependence. All is cause and effect of chains of karma, more and more complex chains. So karma suddenly acquires a great power. And so in many practices, depending on lineages, they spend a lot of time in generating positive karma, undoing negative karma through prayer or other means. And the monks will spend hours every day in that. The prayer wheel, you will have seen, there's this little one here, Ricard. The prayer wheel is a concept which comes similarly. On it are the prayers written, and you move the prayer wheels with your hands. It's as if you're radiating into the universe the positive karma. The prayer flags, similarly, as the wind blows through those flags, you generate positive vibrations which will spread with the wind, and so on. But the idea of the karma, both negative and positive, acquires great force because the freedom of the self has been removed from the picture, the freedom of God has been removed from the picture. And at this stage, all the good karma is precious. And it would be often a matter of great importance that at the end of these meetings, they would make a formulation which would go something like this. May all the good karma accumulated by this gathering be given to, and they would name either a person or an institution or somebody else, not for yourself. Always the idea was this. Whatever goodness you generate, not for yourself, but for others. And one of the most common formulations would be, may it be given to all sentient beings. And so your mind dwells on all beings who are suffering, and whatever goodness we have generated, may it ease their pain in all creation. So, the way of sympathetic oneness and infinite compassion by which the Buddhist arrives at his nirvana. There's two very different paths have been indicated. Both of them include this particular experience of oneness experienced with all beings, even at a material level, in emotions and in mind. So this is spoken of as the highest achievement, but it is for Sri Aurobindo a path to a greater achievement. And how? So now subsequently in the lines which proceed, he will show us that there are degrees through which we pass, even in this kind of a universality or cosmicity of consciousness. And in those degrees we will see how there can be a much greater freedom and there can be a lesser freedom. So the first, he says, in the first stage, the soul is still subject to the reactions of the duality, still subject therefore to the lower prakriti. Now let's say in this pursuit of your consciousness, you have opened out, you experience all this oneness with all beings, oneness with the whole universe, oneness with all hearts and their sufferings and their joys and their minds and thoughts, and all this is part of your experience of the cosmic consciousness. The soul, the center of your consciousness, is still subject to the reactions of the duality. The suffering still causes me pain. The happiness still awakens in me a response of joy. Still subject, therefore, to the lower Prakriti, the lower nature of which we were a part before we experienced this larger freedom. It is depressed or hurt by the cosmic suffering, elated by the cosmic joy. So such a being living in this kind of a consciousness but subject to the reactions of the duality, he will see the suffering and feel himself overwhelmed. He will see the joy and feel himself overwhelmed with the joy. On a scale which is cosmic, of course. So he gives an example. We suffer the joys of others, suffer their griefs. And this oneness can be carried even into the body. It's very suggestive, his vocabulary. Sri Aurobindo says, we suffer the joys of others. What do you mean? You would say we enjoy the joys of others. No, he says we suffer the joys of others. Because in fact, when in our current experience, in the ego consciousness, when somebody is very happy, what happens to you? Some part in you says, why not me? Or some part in you says, even as you enjoy it, what if it goes away tomorrow? How will I manage? This is so precious. I must hold on to every moment. Always there is something which suffers because of the nature of the experience of joy. And that's of course when we are in the duality in an ego consciousness. But when we are in a cosmic consciousness but subject to the duality, then it takes a different form. You see this joy and the joy is overwhelming. And something in your system cannot take it. And it suffers the impact of that intensity. Suffers their griefs. But both ways is a kind of suffering. And this oneness can be carried even into the body. As in the story of the Indian saint, this is Ramakrishna Paramahansa, who, seeing a bullock tortured in the field by its cruel owner, cried out with the creature's pain. And the wheel of the lash was found reproduced on his own flesh. And we referred to this earlier also. And this oneness can be experienced in the heart, in the mind, but it can also be registered in the body in this example. What would it be like if in his consciousness he were to feel all the bullocks of the world and all the whiplashes and all the pain on the hearts of people and all the tortures of the bodies of every human being? Well, your body would break down. If every lash is creating a wheel, how will you survive? Isn't it? And the same, you remove the identification in the body, in the emotional being, you will be overwhelmed. It is literally like drinking poison. Not just one little cup, the poison which is everywhere in the world. It is this which is the powerful image given in the Puranic story, when during the churning of the waters of consciousness, before the nectar of immortality emerges, there is the release of the poison. And the poison fills the entire world and suffocates everything. The world would have been swallowed up in the poison. And the only one who could take the burden of the poison is the Lord himself. And so Shiva is called and he drinks the poison. But if he takes it into himself, what happens to him? So he holds it in his throat. Interesting idea. He never allows the poison to overwhelm him. He takes it out of the world, but he has to remain he. So somewhere in between the world and he, in his throat it is held. And the throat becomes blue. And then there is the snake who comes to soothe it. Again, deeply symbolic. But this idea that the divine himself takes up the burden of the suffering is very much part of the yogic tradition. In the Buddhist approach, the divine has been removed from the picture. So you have to bear the suffering. Of course, in the Mahayana approach of Buddhism, which is closer to the old yogic approach and the tantric knowledge of India, they still call upon the Buddha himself. He is present, his presence. He takes up, he shares the burden. It is his aspect of compassion which takes up the burden of the suffering in the world. So that idea comes back in a different way. But otherwise, the truth is, the divine himself, in his identification in the very substance of the world, takes the burden of the suffering. What we experience is only the surface ripples of it. Anything more we would not be able to bear. But that little which we get is so overwhelming for us. We say, oh, I am suffering, I am so miserable, I am in so much pain, and so on. So, we suffer the joys of others, suffer their griefs, and this oneness can be carried even into the body. But there must be, he says, there must be a oneness in the freedom of Satchidananda as well as with the subjection of the lower being to the reactions of Prakriti. So now he reminds us, look, there is this part where you are subject to the lower Prakriti, but there is also this other part of your consciousness in the cosmic consciousness above the mind, life and body. There, in that experience, you also have the oneness in the freedom of Satchidananda. Remember, we started with that as the first focus and then worked upon this. That is also there, and this is also there. This part is maybe still bound in the lower nature, but that part is not. That has a freedom. And there's a kind of a duality in the consciousness. This oneness in the freedom of Satchidananda, as well as subjection of the lower being to the Prakriti, this is achieved when the soul is free and superior to the cosmic reactions, which are then felt in the life, mind and body as an inferior movement. The soul understands, accepts, sympathizes, but is not overpowered or affected. So that even the mind and the body learn also to accept without being overpowered or even affected, except on their surface. So here comes now the relationship of these two and the higher freedom bringing its influence into the lower binding and freeing it to that extent. So, when the soul is free and superior to the cosmic reactions, where is the center of your awareness? Where is the you who is experiencing? If this you in life body, then of course there is this overwhelming. When this you shifts into that higher poise, based in that greater freedom, no more bound in the ego consciousness, the soul is free and superior to the cosmic reactions. And those reactions are felt in the life, mind and body as an inferior movement, but they are not primarily in you. Now this we can, what is meant by inferior movement, we can understand with a few examples. The more coarse examples, let's say you have an injury on your little finger. It's hurting, it's in pain. What do? You can step back from it, disengage from the identification. The pain is there, but you can still function. Every now and then the pain calls you, when it throbs a little bit, it calls your attention, distracts you. But you don't say, I am in pain, I am suffering, oh my finger is hurting. But if that same pain somehow overwhelmed you in the head or in the chest, when you have a severe headache, you cannot function. Because the very center of your consciousness is somehow destabilized. So between this center being destabilized and the edge being destabilized, you understand what is meant by peripheral or superficial. Similarly, when We have, in our psychology, there are many levels at the same time. As in the example taken earlier, somebody is extremely happy. A part in you identifies and shares. Oh, it happens to be my best friend. Oh, it happens to be my child. I have to be happy. And yet there is this small part, because that's part of our human makeup, which says, oh, but what about me? If only I had that. Both reactions are there at the same time. Which is dominant? When the other, who is happy, is my enemy, then the jealousy is stronger and my identification is peripheral. When the other is myself, my child, my brother, sister, friend, someone close to me, as if myself extended, then my happiness is great and my jealousy is small. But you can see how both are there and they could easily shift balance. But when they're so small, you hardly even notice it. If someone says, oh, are you aware that inside you there's also a jealousy? How dare you say that? How can I be jealous of my own child? But the reality is it's there. It's a little pocket. It's somewhere in the corner. It's peripheral. And so when we are in this higher consciousness centered in the Satchidananda and its freedom, in its oneness, at that point the reactions felt in the life, mind and body are felt as an inferior movement. Interesting, you will see Sri Aurobindo uses, the sequences are very important. He says, reactions felt in the life, mind and body. He doesn't say mind, life, body or body, life, mind, which should be the normal sequence. Looking down from above, mind would come first, then life, then body. No, life. Because the crux of suffering is always in the life energies. It is there that you have the attachments, the reactions. The mind can easily be equal, detached. Life cannot be. So, first reaction is in the mind, in the life. And then it is mind which gives to it a value. So that follows next. It gives it a value greater or lesser. And then the body is the most distant in the experience, as an inferior movement. The soul understands, accepts, sympathizes, but is not overpowered or affected. And again, 3 degrees. There is an understanding. It happens, that is how it is. It accepts, even allows it entry to some extent. Sympathizes, experiences in identity. So there starts with a distance and grows closer. And in the empathy, you have the experience of sharing in the other. And we'll see this happening in human relations when an adult is supporting a child who's suffering. So, a mother, for example, who looks after the child is hurt, he is crying, wants attention, wants affection, and the mother says, oh, don't worry, you'll be well. And the child says, you don't know how much I am suffering. Okay? So there is an understanding at first, you do not see the empathy immediately. And the mother says, yes, I know, you see, I have also felt this. And she tries to come closer, and at some point there's this empathy, an energetic continuum which is felt. The child feels that the mother feels, and somehow in the identification the mother absorbs the pain and the distress into herself. And suddenly the child feels released from it. This can have not only emotional character, it can even have a physical character of pain. And we see this, it's so easy in children for them to lose the pain. I don't know if in various cultures it takes different forms. In some cultures, when a child has an injury, the mother will kiss the injury. And immediately the child feels as if the pain is gone. Or in some they will hug. And even a fever can be absorbed in that identification. In many ways it is done. But in this sympathy, there is the absorption. But does the mother now feel pain in her finger? No, it's gone. Does she feel the pain in the heart? Perhaps, but it's nominal, peripheral, manageable, not overpowered or affected. This is the word Sri Aurobindo uses here. The soul understands, accepts, sympathizes, but is not overpowered or affected. Now put this in the context of the suffering in the universe. The soul understands, accepts, sympathizes, but is not overpowered or affected. Why? Because it sees from a consciousness of oneness in which the division and multiplicity are seen as a secondary phenomenon, and the suffering which comes from the division is also a part of that, something accepted, even perhaps necessary in the process of the evolution. So when the mother observes the child struggling again and again to walk and falling, she doesn't start crying if the child is hurt. She waits. She gives encouragement. She extends a hand to hold him, to help him gain balance, to help him learn. But it is inevitable. He has to pass through this passage. There is no other way. There is a beautiful example given. When a butterfly is trying to break out of its cocoon, it goes through enormous pain. It is so exhausted in the process of cutting a hole and pulling itself out that often it is about to collapse. It needs to rest for about an hour, dry its wings, and then suddenly it can open out and fly. Now, if in the process it is cut the cocoon and let it come out freely, the butterfly will come out, but when it is dry, it has not grown the muscles enough to fly. So you have to allow it. You have to allow it the suffering. How much? You cut a little bit, maybe you've cut too much. You freed it too easily. Or you have to let it suffer, struggle. Only when you feel it's about to die in its cocoon, you may cut a little bit to encourage it to come out. But the minimum help, just to prevent the point where it could extinguish its own life. Seen from a higher spiritual perspective, when you do the whole journey of awakening and evolution, it's something like this. It's almost as if you have to go through these passages, and all you can do is when you find things on the brink of collapse or loss, an intervention to prevent that. But otherwise, the less you intervene, the more perfect, the more complete, the stronger will be what emerges. And that's the challenge for the one who wants to help. What you can do is take up the burden of the suffering, but you cannot remove it entirely. It's almost as if it's necessary as a goad for us, for our growth. So in the cosmic consciousness, in the oneness, in the freedom of Satchidananda, the soul understands, accepts, sympathizes, but is not overpowered or affected. So that even the mind and body learn also to accept without being overpowered or even affected, except on their surface. So if this is held in the higher consciousness, eventually the mind catches this. Now you see again the sequence, so that the mind and the body learn also. It doesn't start with life, it starts with mind and then the body. Because the mind is the part most elastic, most plastic, most open to the experience of the higher. And it is in the mind that these ideas settle in us and we begin to see and even identify with that perspective. And so in this part, yes, we can see, all right, this I understand. I accept, I sympathize, and eventually all the way to the body. But always not overpowered. Without being overpowered or even affected, except on their surface. So again, 3 degrees of this. Not being overpowered, but you're affected. Not being affected, but you still have a superficial response. So, overpowered is when you get so overwhelmed that you are unable to function. Not being overpowered, but you're affected, it does touch, something does experience, there is something, but you're able to manage. And the third degree is even that is so superficial as if to be almost nothing except on the surface. So like you get a pinprick, an injury on the finger, briefly the finger moves in a reflex. That's the surface reaction. And then you look at the finger, okay, it's hurting. There's pain. What do we need to do? And you do what needs to be done. As if you were bandaging another person. You don't start shouting and screaming because it's hurting. Because, well, that's how it is. And everything, even in the suffering of the world that one takes on. There is an interesting observation the mother made. You know that for a long time, mother did not permit photographs of Sri Aurobindo to be taken. Because the nature of the yoga was so intense, she was waiting for a decisive transition, for the physical transformation. And at some point, when Sri Aurobindo had taken the decision that he would have to withdraw, mother accepted to have the photographs taken. And for various reasons, it was the French photographer Cartier-Bresson. There were many in the ashram who could have taken pictures, perhaps even better ones. But mother wanted somehow for these photos to have a special value in the international space. And well, she accepted for him to take the photos. But she comments about it. She says earlier, he used to have such a sweet smile. But by the time these photos were taken, he had already taken upon himself the burden of the world's suffering. It is something we have seen in the lives of most great spiritual beings, that on some level their very physical presence involves taking a burden of the world to whatever degree. But we've seen this pattern in the lives of many, that when it comes time for them to withdraw from the physical body, they take on the burden more completely. It's almost as if once the decision is taken for the body to be withdrawn, that is used as a means, a way to help the world and at the same time to consume whatever burden is there in the body's own extinction, and thus help the world most physically. And we have seen this also among some of their disciples. In the Tibetan tradition, there is the story of the great Saint Milarepa, who towards the end of his physical life was in his bed, and his body was in intense pain, but he didn't show too much sign of it. And then to demonstrate to his disciples what it is that he had taken on himself, he said, for a moment now, I will transfer the suffering that I have taken on me to that big door. And their monastery had this gigantic, heavy, thick door. And immediately it is recorded that the door began to shake violently, rattle, and it broke down into powder. The possibility of taking an enormous burden of suffering of the whole world, not just the earth, the universe even, depending on their role, it could be the earth or something greater. The possibility of taking that on is only because in the body consciousness already something more profound has been held. Otherwise it would shatter. Because there is the foundation of the oneness of the self held in the body consciousness itself, it can take on that burden. Otherwise, in whatever level of consciousness in which that oneness is established, it can take on the burden and thus assist the forward evolution to whatever extent it helps. So, without being overpowered or even affected, except on their surface. And in the most surface parts you may find some reaction, some wincing, but it's almost like a mosquito bites you, your hand goes whack or your face momentarily but it doesn't bother you. It's as superficial as that. So I'm reminded of this mother's description or her comment that by the time she had accepted to take the photos of Sri Aurobindo, he had taken upon himself the burden of the world. And you can see that somewhere in those photos. And the consummation of this movement is when the two spheres of existence are no longer divided, and the mind, life and body grow into the spirit's freedom. So here, remember, we are speaking of two domains of experience of oneness. One above, in the oneness in Satchidananda and its freedom, and the other by its reflection, by its influence in the mind, life and body. Now, this can go on. How far will it go on? Until the two practically begin to merge. There is no more a separation, not just an influence, but literally a merging of the lower into the higher. That's the consummation, the union of the two. The two spheres of existence, the upper and the lower sphere, are no longer divided. So far there's still a gap. Something has to descend from above, influencing the lower to give it a foundation of real freedom in oneness. This two spheres, the Vedic description is of this kind. There is the upper sphere or the lower sphere, or the upper hemisphere and the lower hemisphere, depending on how one chooses to visualize it. If you see the oneness above as a completeness, and the mind-created world below of division as a completeness, you have two spheres and a point of contact. In the Vedic description, there are two hemispheres, the upper half and the lower half. The Satchidananda, and as if its reflection in divided consciousness in matter, life and mind. The Sat, pure existence, corresponds to matter and its sheer existence. The Chit and the Chit Shakti, consciousness energy corresponds to the life energies, and the consciousness of the Chit is corresponding to the mind, and the Ananda corresponds to that which is suffused through all these three as the psychic influence, the psychic being and the soul center. But these three and the upper three are as if reflecting each other, and in between is the linking principle. So he is bringing us to this idea as we proceed, and in the next paragraph he will speak of the link through which alone this complete joining can take place. So, but right now it is a movement to grow, for the mind, life and body to grow into the spirit's freedom. From the lower or ignorant response to the cosmic touches and subjection to the duality. So the earlier poise was, here in the mind, in the life, in the body, you have the cosmicity, the cosmic mind, cosmic life, cosmic matter, all impacting and provoking some kind of a response which belongs to the old, past, lower nature. So the lower or ignorant responses to the cosmic touches. And to the extent that this consciousness is not transformed, it is subject to the experience of dualities. It is still overwhelmed or affected somehow by the differences between these two extremes. So we read the whole sentence now. And the consummation of this movement is when the two spheres of existence are no longer divided, and the mind, life and body grow into the spirit's freedom from the lower or ignorant response to the cosmic touches, and the subjection to the duality ceases. When it ceases, what happens? Apparently, no reaction. Extreme suffering, extreme happiness, neither affects or overwhelms you. At best, some superficial response. What does it mean? Have you become like stone then? So he says, this does not mean insensibility to the struggles and sufferings of others, but it does mean a spiritual supremacy and freedom which enables one to understand perfectly, put the right values on things, and heal from above instead of struggling from below. So 3 things he has described. First is that there is a spiritual supremacy and freedom. You are still sensing the struggle and the sufferings of others, but there is a freedom and the authority, the supremacy of the spirit, which allows you to deal with it without being overwhelmed by it. Second, as a result of this spiritual supremacy and freedom, enables one to understand perfectly, put the right values on things. So you understand where this comes from, why it's necessary, what purpose it serves in relation to everything else. At no point are you confused or clouded by the nature of things or their appearances. And the third, from this poise, not only you have understood and put the right value, you have the power to heal from above instead of struggling from below. Now, not only this description applies to that particular consciousness in the cosmic consciousness, it applies even to us as we are today in our ego consciousness. When we face difficulties in life, there are always 2 responses in us. Depending on where we center our consciousness, one or the other of these responses will be more active. Both are existent simultaneously. If I identify myself in my narrow, petty, personal interest, then the larger response is of the struggling from below. I am fighting, I am trying to overcome, I am trying to resist, I am exhausted, I give up, I am overwhelmed, I collapse. But this is the struggle from below. And there's another part higher up which looks at this and says, that's what it is. If I can consciously shift myself into that, yes, there is this difficulty, but, and I can tell myself, this too shall pass. Everything changes, this also has to change, isn't it, eventually? Let me find a way to survive this while it's on. And I can see how through this process I'm going to overcome all these limitations, I'm going to get free of this, and it's great compassion and so on. I'll share with you a personal experience. At a certain stage, and it was part of a process of the breaking of the ego, I went through a very difficult passage of intense inner trauma, emotional, psychological, and even of identity. And it was so extreme, so painful that I couldn't imagine that I would be able to survive it. And it was at a time when I had already committed to certain programs. So I still remember the first time that it happened. I was sitting there, and within an hour or so I had a lecture with a group of students. And I said to myself, what will I tell them? Because anything I have to say has to come from some living experience. I can't just talk of things which to me are unreal. I'm going to go there and just tell them life is not worth living. And well, okay, so I woke up, and there are 3 steps I climbed to the stage. As I completed the 3rd step, it was as if from above everything poured in, and the hell was full. And I sat there and I spoke, and whatever came was beautiful. And I said, this is so nice, I'm back to what I was. And I take 3 steps down, and shoop, the whole thing is sucked out. And again I'm this empty shell, in such severe pain of emptiness, of meaninglessness of life. And this happened again and again and again. And at some point I said, well, Mother, you're doing this to me. You're putting me through this suffering. Why are you doing this to me? And of course there's all these reactions in the lower part. even a reaction of the child who's petulant, who's revolting. Why are you doing this to me? Why are you putting? But I cannot abandon the truth of the being, which is that I belong to her. And so there's another part which says, yes, there's a great purpose, there's a deep purpose. I cannot understand right now here, but there's something very important happening, and it's being done, and something is being broken, something is being taught, something very important. Of course, over time it became more clear. It was in the body consciousness that I was being taught. You see, the mind can understand, the emotions can accept, but the body is the most rigid, and it needs often to experience something intensely for a sustained time to learn its lesson. And the body was being taught that without the divine, it is meaningless. Everything is hollow, empty, meaningless. I, person, the shell is a shell which has value when it is filled with the juice. You remove the juice, it's just a shell, it has no value. It's like husk of the green. But this was really deeply embedded into the physical consciousness until it could not be lost anymore. It had to be taken to that point, to breaking point, literally. And at some stage I began to understand what was happening, but still there was this part. I would stand before the mother, open myself. Mother, you do what you have to do. And I'm looking down. I cannot look her in the eye. You're putting me through this suffering. This is a very interesting double experience. I'm sharing this because it has value for everybody at some stage or other in your own journey. That we recognize there are these two parts. And the lower part necessarily has to go through its normal struggle from below. And then there is this higher part which knows, which is open to and able to receive. And if you can consciously put yourself in its poise, in its view, in its greater closeness to what is true and real, then things become much easier. And from there it can call down the help. So heal from above instead of struggling from below. I'm describing this experience in the context of the ego. But here the text is about the cosmic consciousness. In a widened, not necessarily cosmic, in a widened consciousness already, there is the higher in which one can draw from above to heal. And in the cosmic, of course, that which is drawn has the ability to heal and hold the whole, the infinite. In the stories we heard, I come back to the example of this Venerable Mahaghoshananda. In the stories we heard about him and the way he led people into the country, walked across village to village, and people would meet each other and say, "Oh, you are alive, we didn't know." The peace that he brought in people's hearts, every time, always with a smiling face. Never once you saw on his face any sign of pain or suffering. Although he held everybody, carried them with him, the people coming in his contact would feel liberated from their pain and suffering. That's why I described him as one of the greatest saints, almost unknown in the world. But these beings came with a purpose. They came to establish or change something fundamentally. Vibhutis, we will say. Divine beings come for a mission to heal the suffering of Cambodia in this case. But they cannot fulfill that mission if there is not supporting behind something which is large enough. Even if the focus was Cambodia, the burden of that mass and the suffering was so great, it had to be a consciousness which is infinite, supporting from behind, and which allows through the very presence to impact and bring that healing. Just one man. What followed around him, people caught that inspiration. They still remember him and draw from that. He withdrew from the body, but the inspiration he brought still continues. That power, the vibhuti itself, is not bound to the body. It continues to inspire. And I saw that in the person, Bob Mart, who was representing him in the meetings which we had, and I'm sure there are others like that. And I could see in him the power to transmit this experience in those he met, in the very narration of the story. In the interactions with Bob, he never preached, he never taught, he never speaks of any philosophy or practice. He just tells his story and his experience, and that's all. And it leaves an impact, changes people, and they're inspired to follow. And that's the power which is brought, backing behind it something which is infinite. It's interesting to me, the name given to him, Mahaghoshananda. Maha is great. You see, it comes from the Vedic term Mahas, which is an aspect, the infinity of the Maha suggests infinity. Ghosha is announcement, revelation, but in a way that impacts, which brings a message, which changes people, inspires. Ananda, delight, bliss. So Mahaghoshananda, the great announcer of bliss, you would say, or the great blissful announcer. And literally his life has that character. But this is possible only when you have this infinity behind. And so, heal from above instead of struggling from below. It does not inhibit the divine compassion and helpfulness, but it does inhibit the human and animal sorrow and suffering. So this poise of the consciousness, which is based in a spiritual supremacy and freedom, we can put right value to things and heal from above. This poise, it does not inhibit the divine compassion and helpfulness that can continue to flow fully, but it does inhibit the human and animal sorrow and suffering. They are enormously reduced. Yourself, remember, you are identified with all. Its impact is to reduce in all. So even one will say, as long as these spiritual beings are on earth, to the extent that they tune in to take on the burden of the suffering or pain of others, everyone on the earth is helped. You may not realize who it is in whom that burden is taken up. It doesn't matter to them. But when they leave, suddenly we will find the weight of the burden increasing. Unless someone else comes who is there to take that burden. Or a few who may share. And so in many spiritual traditions, they speak of, according to their lineage, the number varies. In one of the Sufi lineages, I was told 48 people. In other lineages, the number is not so important. There are always a few yogis, saints, sages, whatever name you give to them. They may be sitting alone in their mountaintop or cave or forest or little house in the middle of a city unknown to anybody. But there are always on earth a few, whatever the number, who as if support human evolution in taking in part the burden of humanity in whatever aspect of it, and at the same time pushing forward certain movements, certain tendencies, something of the aspiration, inspiring. Sometimes in their lone meditation, holding this base in humanity, in their lone meditation they will dwell on something, some possibility, and that being articulated in their consciousness will create a ripple in the larger human space. You will recall Sri Aurobindo mentioning how it was a yogi in the Himalayas who dreamt of liberty, equality and fraternity, and that created a small revolution in France. But many such revolutions, you will see, they seem to happen sometimes in synchronicity. We had just a few years ago something with what they call the Arab Spring. And then they gave it all kinds of colors. I don't even remember the colors, blue, green springs in different places. Suddenly, in many countries in the Middle East, young people woke up and wanted and were attracted to an ideal. I've mentioned before here, we were in Egypt. I was with a group, similar group of representing many traditions from the world. And we were in Egypt about 2 weeks after that event in the square, Tahrir Square, was it? Tahrir Square, where for 3 days people just came out of their homes and lived as one family. Everyone loved each other, shared food, assisted each other, and they just asked for the government to be changed. It had its effect, but after that the military came and began to shoot them and so on. And it was still fresh in the collective memory. We could feel it. We went even in Tahrir Square, we could feel that. It was as if something had descended, some kind of a light which united people and just awoke them. And in hearing the narrations from the people, they were saying it was utopian. It was so beautiful. It's as if all divisions were gone. We were all one. We were all together as one big family. It was such a happy period. It was as if a heaven on earth experience. And it cannot last. Because human nature being what it is, this is being received in the higher parts, and after a while the lower parts start surging up. What about me? What about my need, my demand? And they start pulling, breaking the light, and it tends to break up very quickly. But having experienced it once, the memory stays. Why can't it be again? Why can't we now recreate it with a little bit of effort? Maybe not with those thousands, tens of thousands, maybe just amongst ourselves, maybe among the 10, 20 or 100 that we are. And the memory of it allows you to slip back into that state of consciousness. The light which was received momentarily, which is now half withdrawn, can be called back, relived, recalled, and reawakened and kindled in a few. And so perhaps many pockets will form. We were part of one group which was such a pocket. They meet every week and they used to have some kind of spiritual sharing and things like that. You could see a light on the faces of each one of them. Just the fact to know that such a group exists was such a revelation. But there must be others we didn't know about. But in this very act, coming back to the discussion, in this very act of holding this space, healing from above and holding and supporting humanity, something is lifted, some burden reduced, and it is felt distinctly in the collective consciousness. So it does not inhibit the divine compassion and helpfulness, but it does inhibit the human and animal sorrow and suffering. This being said, Sri Aurobindo now moves to how these two halves can be completely healed. The link between the spiritual and the lower planes of the mental being is that which is called in the old Vedantic phraseology the Vijnana, and which we may term the truth plane or the ideal mind or supermind, where the one and the many meet. And our being is freely open to the revealing light of the divine truth in the infusion of the divine will and knowledge. If we can break down the veil of the intellectual, emotional and sensational mind which our ordinary existence has built between us and the divine, we can then take up through the truth mind all the mental, vital and physical experience and offer it up to the spiritual, to be converted into the terms of the infinite truth of Satchidananda. And we can receive the powers and illuminations of the infinite existence in forms of a divine knowledge and will and delight to be imposed on our mentality, vitality, physical existence, till the lower is transformed into the perfect vessel of the higher. Now all of this we have read, only to complete the line of thought. We will take it up next time. It's a whole paragraph needing many elaborations and nuances. But this is the direction to which he is leading, which will be the greatest completeness in the experience of cosmic consciousness. In the I find a passage where this is described. How the liberated consciousness in the cosmic consciousness experiences all things of the physical, vital and mental world as its own, and yet can bring down the higher into the lower and to assist it. And I want to read from that. This is in Savitri's journey in the canto titled The Cosmic Spirit and Cosmic Consciousness. It's a whole page that I will read, but it captures all the fine nuances of this experience. Page 556. Her spirit saw the world as living God. It saw the One and knew that all was He. She knew Him as the absolute, as Absolute's self-space, one with herself and ground of all things here, in which the world wanders, seeking for the truth, guarded behind its face of ignorance. She followed Him through the march of endless time. All nature's happenings were events in her. The heartbeats of the cosmos were her own. And if you observe in space, gigantic movements of galaxies, solar systems, even the sun and the planets, everything is pulsating. Everything is pulsating. The sun has a pulsating movement. It expands and contracts. The earth has a pulsating movement. Every planet, every galaxy. And literally these are felt as heartbeats. The heartbeats of the cosmos were her own. All beings thought and felt and moved in her. She inhabited the vastness of the world. Its distances were her nature's boundaries, its closenesses, her own life's intimacies. Her mind became familiar with its mind. Its body was her body's larger frame, in which she lived and knew herself in it, one, multitudinous in its multitudes. So the oneness and the multiplicity join here. She was a single being, yet all things. The world was her spirit's wide circumference. The thoughts of others were her intimates, their feelings close to her universal heart, their bodies her many bodies kin to her. She was no more herself, but all the world. Out of the infinitudes, all came to her. Into the infinitudes, sentient, she spread. You see this double movement. From the universe, everything comes, and from this center, everything goes. Infinity was her own natural home. Nowhere she dwelt. Her spirit was everywhere. The distant constellations wheeled around her. Earth saw her born. All worlds were her colonies. The greater worlds of life and mind were hers. All nature reproduced her in its lines. Its movements were large copies of her own. She was the single self of all these selves. She was in them and they were all in her. This first was an immense identity in which her own identity was lost. What seemed herself was an image of the whole. It's as if the whole is represented in a small formed outline. She was a subconscient life of tree and flower, the outbreak of the honeyed buds of spring. She burned in the passion and splendor of the rose. She was the red heart of the passion flower, the dream white of the lotus in its pool. Out of the subconscient life, she climbed to mind. She was thought and the passion of the world's heart. She was the Godhead hid in the heart of man. She was the climbing of his soul to God. The cosmos flowered in her. She was its bed. She was time and the dreams of God in time. She was space and the wideness of his days. From this she rose where time and space were not. The superconscient was her native air. Infinity was her movement's natural space. Eternity looked out from her on time. So it is from this poise that she is now ready to face the challenge of death with the power to defeat death. So we can pause here and take up any comments or questions. We will have the next session on the Friday after next. Next Friday we will not have anything.
In temple yoga, talks of completeness. One is absolute, from ignorance to knowledge, and knowledge descends, removing ignorance. Now, in case of nirvana, Buddha is only talking about suffering and removal of suffering. Where does the manifestation go then?
In the objective that the Buddha set, the goal was to get free of suffering. What happens to the manifestation is irrelevant, because it is seen that the world itself is a product of the mind. When the mind is extinguished, there is no world and no suffering. Or world may continue, but you are free of suffering. If that you set as your goal, then the rest doesn't matter. It is similar to the Shankaracharya's approach, where the world is seen as an illusion. And if you get out of the suffering into the bliss of Brahman, then world remains only as a superficial appearance which is illusory. It doesn't matter. In both approaches there is a withdrawal and an abandonment of the world. But if that be your goal, that's fine. But if your goal is then to re-enter the world to help others, it is still to take them out of the suffering. So there are many variations to Buddhist practice which do not see the world as something to be abandoned. They also have this idea that this freedom should be realized in life, and one should be able to live in life free of suffering. And these are special branches of Buddhism. So there are many divisions even within the Buddhist general philosophy and practices.
But against suffering, there is joy also. So why didn't they joy also? Because
Their view is joy and suffering are both equally part of the duality. If you wish to chase after joy, you cannot separate yourself from suffering. You have to transcend both. Chasing after joy is not a solution. Once you have transcended, then both joy and suffering are equally colors of the life experience. But you live in a different consciousness, which is free of the limitations of both. In the Vedantic vocabulary, we will say, then you live in the consciousness of bliss, where you can taste the rasa, the delight of all experiences, including the delight of joy and of sorrow. Both contain in themselves an aspect of the delight. So you can fully engage with life, but every experience is for you a nurturing of delight.
My question still remains unanswered. Then where does the manifestation go? After you reach the nirvana and you don't come back, you see. Then where does the manifestation
It may continue, it doesn't matter. You are not concerned anymore.
Then who is gone and who is, you see,
You have withdrawn in this approach, when in either of these approaches, when you withdraw from the world may continue, but it's none of your concern anymore. You have withdrawn. You are merged in either the emptiness or the bliss, whatever form it takes.
you have withdrawn into the absolute, no?
Mm-hmm.
Not in
Yes.
some
Yes.
outer space or something.
Yes. Yes.
But
So you are free of it. If you choose to turn your attention to the world, it's still there. You may choose to engage with it, or you may choose not to. So in many of the Buddhist traditions, there are those beings who choose to re-engage to help humanity to get free. And they are then seen as the ones, I think they're called Avalokiteshvara. They come to help the liberated ones who come to help in this. Avalokiteshvara, if I remember right.
But sir, the manifestation is absolute delight.
Mhm.
But
But you can choose to concentrate on the oneness of the Absolute and thus become blind to the multiplicity of the manifestation. It's a choice you make. That is why in the Isha Upanishad it is described as a darkness. To immerse only in oneness with no awareness of the multiplicity is a darkness. But it's a choice you may make.
But integral yoga is completely
So this, yes. So that is that's the difference of the approach. But the point being, there is a choice always. Yes,
My question is different from today's subject.
yes.
When we sleep, what are the stages
I'll discuss that with you separately. I'll discuss afterwards. There is one sonnet which I will read from, which describes this movement of identification as well as the thing above, the poise above. Cosmic consciousness. Sri Aurobindo describes this poise. I have wrapped the wide world in my wider self, and time and space my spirit's seeing are. I am the god, the demon, ghost and elf. I am the wind's speed and the blazing star. All nature is the nursling of my care. I am the struggle and the eternal rest. You see, both of the lower and the higher. The world's joy thrilling runs through me. I bear the sorrow of millions in my lonely breast. So both of these extremes of infinity of joy, infinity of the sorrow. The world's joy thrilling runs through me. I bear the sorrow of millions in my lonely breast. I have learned a close identity with all, yet am by nothing bound that I become. So this is the poise above. Carrying in me the universe's call, I mount to my imperishable home. I pass beyond time and life on measureless wings, yet still am one with born and unborn things. You see the oneness in the form, the oneness in the formless, and the full spectrum and the completeness of the cosmic consciousness. We will continue this. Next Friday, as I said, we will not be here, but the Friday after I will be out of station for 3 more weeks. And 16th. Yes. So we will continue this on the Friday, April 6th. So a full month. Yes. We will have Sunday class though in between the 2 Sundays. Can briefly meditate on this.